Okay, I think I'm live. I want to read a little bit of a book tonight that I've been reading. It's called Trauma and the Soul. And I read something earlier that really, probably about 2 weeks ago, that really touched my heart. And it's about the self-care system of how we are affected and what happens. It explains what happens when a child is traumatized. And I think for a lot of people out there that are doing the work to try and heal their childhood trauma, that without the psychoeducation, we don't really get to be the best version of ourselves. So I'm going to hopefully read a bit of this, and then within that, you can make up your own mind what you think about it. So it should be, let me just move my microphone. Okay, so I'm reading from Trauma and the Soul, this book here, for anybody that's watching, and I'm not going to chat whilst I'm reading. I'm just going to read it and then look to see if there's any feedback. So this is page 10. I'm not going to read the whole book, but I'm going to read this bit. It says, Trauma and the Self-Care System. And it says, early relational trauma results from the fact that we are often given more to experience in this life than we can bear to experience consciously. This problem has been around since the beginning of time, but it is especially acute in early childhood because the immaturity of the psyche and or brain are ill-equipped to metabolize and experience. An infant child or young child who is abused, violated, or seriously neglected by a caretaking adult is overwhelmed by intolerable effects that are impossible for it to metabolize, much less understand or even think about it. A shock to the psychosomatic unity of the personality threatens to shatter the child to its very core. It threatens to extinguish that vital spark of the person so crucial for the experience of aliveness and so central to the latter experience of feeling real. Such a shattering of the childhood psyche would be an unimaginable catastrophe, soul murder, as one investigator called it, Schengold, and that's 1989. Fortunately, this shattering almost never happens, at least not completely. Instead, a life-saving split occurs that we call disassociation. So you might have heard about disassociation in trauma, which means that many people go through childhood trauma and we begin to disassociate in childhood by, going inward or having an imaginary friend, or, for me, I used to watch things like The Wizard of Oz or stuff like that. I used to, get lost in believing there were little fairies around and having very strange dreams. For some people, it can then extend into adulthood, where people then turn to alcohol or drugs, codependent relationships, and seeking outside in an imaginary way to not feel the pain that they have experienced or felt. That's the only way a child can, basically switch off, by disassociating. And that's what happens with a lot of adults who have C-PTSD, complex C-PTSD or PTSD. It means that the only way through is by using our imagination. I'm going to read a bit more of this. He then says, fortunately, this shattering almost never happens, at least not completely. Instead, a life-saving split occurs that we call disassociation. Disassociation seals over non-being. So when we're not allowed to be ourselves, then disassociation is like a savior for us, although it's not. He then says, it prevents annihilation of the unit self, substituting multiplicity and an archetypal story that implicitly holds the parts together. The unbearable effect is distributed to different parts of the psyche, soma. These parts cease to know about each other so that the personality does not have to suffer the unspeakable horror of trauma. As a whole, we could say that the psyche shatters itself along inborn fault lines, and that discontinuates or gaps open up in our experience. These self-divisions have survival value because they save a part of the child's innocence and aliveness by splitting it off from the rest of the personality, preserving it for the unconscious for possible future growth and surrounding it with an implicit narrative that is eventually made explicit in dreams. So you might find, like I started having out-of-body experiences really early as a child. I think as young as 3 or 4, I would, think that I could see people in my room. I remember being taken to a clinic for it when I was about something like 7 or 8. Who's that? Sorry. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Skip. Thank you. I just saw your message. So the reality is that, I was taken along for some psychoanalysis of sorts because I used to see things and have out-of-body experiences and float above my body. And what happens is when we've been through severe trauma, or you're being, emotional abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, as a child, you're so young and so, such a beautiful little soul that the only way you're going to survive is by splitting off. There's just no other way around it. The issue that I think for a lot of us, I'm 50 now, and I think that a lot of us who are around that age, and it doesn't matter an age thing, but I know a lot of people who are my age who are suffering immensely, that have had childhood trauma, have not been able to voice it, speak about it. There's a lot of toxic shame about speaking up. If you say you've been sexually abused, people, can't handle it. Or you say that your parents were, maybe cruel to you. People will say things like you've got to forgive them because they're your parents. There are a lot of untruths in this world that are really painful for people who are trying to heal. So I'm going to read a bit more. There's only a couple of pages here. So the next bit is, he said, we could say that the psyche shatters itself along inborn fault lines, and that discontinuates or gaps open up in our experience. These self-divisions have survival value because they save a part of the child's innocence and aliveness by splitting it off from the rest of the personality, preserving it in the unconscious for possible future growth and surrounding it with an implicit narrative that is eventually made explicit in dreams. That's what I was coming back to, the dreams that I had. These continued into my adulthood. Now I see eyes every night, but, I can deal with what I see. He goes on to say, this allows life to go on, albeit at a terrible price, a loss of the animation and vitality that have always been associated with ensouled living. So ironically, dissociative defenses save a vital core of the self while simultaneously losing it or losing it partially. They preserve the seed by cutting it off from the life in the world, at least for a time. We will see both literary and clinical examples of this in chapters 3, 7, and 9. So I would say that whilst I've been reading Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, this is your roadmap to healing your C-PTSD. This will help you understand what your flashbacks are, the 4 Fs, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It will help you to understand how to come out of flashbacks. And it will also help you to get rid of your inner critic. It will help you to understand healthy anger. It will also help you to understand that forgiveness doesn't work for everybody. And it will give you back yourself, this book. It did for me. I've done a lot of grieving. The last year and a half I've spent grieving, and a lot of losses. And I'm back in myself. I'm back in my body. But I went on to read, the Carl Jung stuff I've been reading, and this book is a Jungian therapist called Donald Cowshed, which I'm going to continue reading a little bit of this because it is very important that people have this information who have suffered childhood trauma. And I highly recommend this book as well. A good friend of mine who reads on Carl Jung, a friend of mine who's got a Carl Jung channel, he reads daily. He told me about this book and it prompted me to buy it. So I thank you for that, Skip, if you're watching. So then we go, he says, evidence of this kind of inner division in the traumatized psyche of a child is well established by object relations theory. He says here, Sandor Ferenczi, I can't pronounce that properly, but He says, described such a split in his patients between a regressed self on one hand, retreating into the unconscious mind, and the progressed self that grew up too fast and protected the regressed self. And that's Winnicott 1960, differentiated between a true self and a false or caretaker self designed to protect it, and further demonstrated that the caretaker self usually became identified with the mind, leaving the true self languishing in the body, causing psychosomatic illnesses. And that's Fairbairn 1981. I'm reading it as it says in the book. He then says, derived his understanding of the inner world from the simultaneous internalization of the infant self and its neglectful caretakers, transposed into the inner world as a victim and perpetrator complex. And it says, libidinal ego attacked by an internal saboteur. And he goes on to say, finally, Guntrip 1969 described how the innocent child growing up in a neglectful or abusive environment begins to hate his own immaturity, identifying with the bad parent until a split occurs between a lost heart of the self disappearing into the unconscious, tormented by the anti-libidinal ego. This actually touches my heart and actually wants to make me cry reading that bit, that we have no idea, how abuse is just tragic in childhood, and how it's so not spoken about in society, and how many people are suffering in silence and self-medicating and have nowhere to go. And there's no system in place for perpetrators to, go and put their hand up and say, hey, I've got this problem that I'm sexually attracted to children, or I'm beating my children. All of these perpetrators, whatever the reason is. I mean, I've been abused and I've never abused anybody. So I get very defensive when people say people that have been abused abuse, and that's very offensive to people that have been abused who don't abuse. There's so many generalizations that hold little or no truth. I'll continue reading this little bit on self-care, because then it makes it clear what this is about. But that bit just really touched my heart, that just to imagine the heart of a child being so trashed, and particularly by parents as well. It's just unbelievable. But anyway, going on. He says here, until a split occurs between a lost heart of the self disappearing into the unconscious, tormented. And then he goes, all these investigators concluded that traumatic disassociation in the child leaves an inner world divided between regressed and progressed inner objects. Usually, the regressed part of the personality is represented as a child or infant, often locked away in an inner cocoon. And that's Model 1984, an imprisoning sanctuary, or a psychic retreat, and that's Steiner 1983. Whereas the progressed part might appear as a sadistic, tyrannical figure attacking or imprisoning the child, and that's Fairbairn 1981, or as a false god, but the narcissistic defensive system. So it's almost like, when this happens, narcissism is turned in on the self. And there's a lot of, when children are abused, they end up in self-hatred of themselves as adults. I've had to do a lot of work in getting rid of my own inner critic. It's taken me a couple of years from reading Pete Walker's book. Prior to that book, I wasn't even aware I had C-PTSD, which is not a disorder. It is a response to, traumatic events that have taken place in childhood. And it's, also with people that have been to war, that there's trauma out there, that where people have seen things or experienced things that are really painful to them. And ultimately, part of me doing this and reading on C-PTSD is to empower people, to empower us, and not to moan and groan about, oh, I've been abused and I had this happen. Yes, we need to speak about that bit as well, because it needs to be made public for ourselves. We need a witness to hear our story, because if our story is not fully heard, then we can't evolve it. And we can do that through therapy. We could have a good friend. You know, I've got a mix. I've got a few good friends that I can speak to, and in my full expression of self, and I don't shock them. And I also have therapy once a week in London, at a clinic that is to do with Freud and Carl Jung were honorary vice presidents of a clinic in London that I attend, where they now train the most wonderful therapists to, you know, do this work in the world on trauma. And I think we are evolving, but sometimes when I hear what goes on in the news, I do wonder, but I do think that we are, you know, we're moving ahead because we're speaking about it. So people like me and people out there that I know that are speaking up, that's the leading edge of change. Because in 1970, for instance, you couldn't have spoken about things like this live. You wouldn't have been able to go on YouTube or, you know, upload. There's so many people now who have free access to social platforms that they can begin to raise awareness, which will, you know, protect the incoming children, because that laws will be changed by eventually by people speaking up. That's the beauty of this. Keep reading. He says here, this is Donald Cowshed, by the way. I'm just going to show you the book again, and I'm reading a little bit more. He says, in my early work as an analyst, I began to find the same pattern in the dream material of my patients, the same story, but sometimes with a striking difference in certain patients' dreams. The image of the regressed part of the personality would appear not just as a child, but as an extraordinary child, one that appeared to be supremely wise or divine in some way, perhaps surrounded by an earthly light, or speaking in parables, or showing miraculous physical powers. Sometimes she regressed. Sometimes the regressed self would be a magical animal, a talking bird, a dolphin, or a pony, representing a kind of soul animal for the patient. On the other hand, the progressed self might also become mythologized, appearing as a frightening vampire, a sadistic demon who tortured the patient from within. Sometimes the diabolical, I think that's right, diabolical figure would morph into the opposite, becoming a guardian angel who protected their inner child. Now that's interesting, because at night, and this has been going on for me for a few years now, what I do is I see eyes, like I would call them watchers, like they're, you know, there's something watching me, like eye to eye, and they morph in and out of faces that I've never seen before. And some of them are extremely demonic and, you know, frightening, and then they morph into the most beautiful faces that I've never seen, like the most, you know, angelic, stunning faces. And I seem to be aware, I'm aware in that sleep time, the first 20 minutes. And what I'll do is I'll say, you know, are you off the light? Or I'll know when they are or when they're not. But I think this has been part of my healing, that to see these, and it's like communication in healing and the psyche in the sleep time, you know, where I'm standing up to the demonic ones. In fact, I swear at them in my sleep. I don't know if I swear out loud, but I do, you know, fight back at them. And then the beautiful ones come in and they soothe me, and I feel this safety. So it's, I don't know if anybody else out there has these sort of dreams like that, you know. I do know other people that have told me they see eye to eye as well, a few people that I've met over time. So going on. So then he says, then it says, the mythopoetic powers in the self-care system are well represented in the illustration in plate 1, showing Blake's good and evil angels struggling over the terrified child. I just want to show you that. So you see the front of this book here, hopefully. This is what he's referring to here that's in the book, that picture there, where the good and the evil are fighting over the child. I haven't lost my page. So he says, the mythopoetic powers in the self-care system are represented in the illustration in plate 1. The evil angel is shackled in his flaming darkness, and his unseeing eyes represent the deadening trance of the traumatic disassociation. The good angel seems to have wrested the child from him, or at least preventing him from reaching the child. Both of these angels represent the protective or the persecutory side of the defensive system in daimonic form. They pull the child between the two archetypal antinomies, I think, the tortures of hell and the bliss oblivion of heaven. I began to realize that I was observing an archaic and typical archetypal dyad structure in my patient's dream material that was devoted to defense, very similar to both the object relations finding and collective imagery, such as Blake's image above. I refer to this typical dyadic structure as the self-care system. And 15 years ago, I wrote a book about the discoveries, Cowshed 1996. Reported in that book is my further discovery that this system often made its appearance in dreams as critical moments in the psychotherapy process when new life of some kind was emerging from the patient. And that's the beautiful thing about therapy. I've noticed that I have, I had therapy tonight in the UK, and when I sleep, I will get really just these amazing dreams that really are telling my story. And it means that I'm working something through at deeper levels. And some of them are really hard dreams, but at least when I wake up, I know if I wake up, I know they're a dream. I don't get scared. I used to get really scared of these dreams, but now I understand what's going on. He goes on to say, so Blake's image, so he said, reported in the self-care system, often made its appearance in dreams as critical moments in the psychotherapy process when new life of some kind was emerging from the patients. Often in relation to myself in the transference, these moments of emergent hope and potential transformation seem to trigger the defensive activity of the diabolical inner figures who then attacked the patient's vulnerable self in nightmarish dreams, rendering the inner world as traumatized as the outer one, while seemingly designed to isolate and protect a vulnerable core of the personality. The sadistic powers in the system began to attack the very emanated foundation of personality that they were originally designed to protect. Just like the autoimmune disease attacks the body's healthy tissue, it was as though a bargain that was struck to save the vulnerable soul child turned out to be a Faustian bargain with a persecutory devil who kept the soul disembodied and unrealized. So we can see, when, for some people, some people are lucky enough to have one good parent and one, I'm going to say one, the really lucky ones have two great parents. But often what happens, there can be one messed up parent or there can be two messed up parents. But when I say parents, it can also be carers. There can be family members that this can happen between siblings as well. It can happen, aunts, uncles. So we've really, when I say parents, don't outrule yourself as I'm reading this story. It's just that I'm relating to my own story when I say that often. And I must remember that there are other people who've had different experiences out there, which are not just parents that have traumatized them in childhood. Okay. He then says, in the clinical experience that formed the basis of the inner world of trauma, I was so impressed by the tyrannical negative forces in the system and the dynamic power of these forces to undermine hope and drive patients into repetition compulsion. Okay, so repetition compulsion, this is a beautiful one to explain if people don't know what it is. What it is that you suffer abuse as a child, whether it's sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse or violence. And then the repetition compulsion or abandonment or betrayal. And it means that in adulthood that you will repeat these patterns by choosing, not on purpose, bumping into people and choosing partners maybe or work where you will bump into the same people. And what we need to do is resolve the repetition compulsion in ourselves. And we're not going to be able to do that on our own. We do need help with that. We need somebody that we can speak to. And we also need to, therapy. And we also, because I'm not a therapist, I'm somebody that's just got the experience who, I also do astrology. I help people understand their trauma, but I'm not a medical practitioner. So the thing is, what you need to do is really look at if you are suffering emotionally, or you're disassociating, or you're in situations that you don't want to be in, and you have had an abusive childhood, you need to start looking at it. And the first thing I would say to everybody, and somebody said it's not the only book in the world. I got thrown out of a healing group the other day for posting 13 steps for managing flashbacks, which amused me somewhat. But from this book. So there you go. That's the one you need. I'm going to keep reading this little bit here, a little bit more. He says here, in the clinical experiences that formed the basis for the inner world of trauma, I was so impressed by the negative forces in the system and the dynamic power of these forces to undermine hope and drive patients into the repetition compulsion. Freud, 1926. He says here that I suggested that the self-care system was mostly uneducable. I no longer have such a pessimistic view. Further clinical experience and an acquaintance with current applications of attachment theory, and he mentions a couple of names here, which I won't go through. He says, current applications of attachment theory and effective neuroscience. He's got a lot of people that he's referring here to. He says, the Relational School in New York, Broomberg, and recent experience with a model and methods of intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy as practiced by Patricia Colin Della Selva, 1996, have all combined to reinform my own technique and make the psychotherapeutic work I do with trauma survivors more effective, effect-centered, embodied, and relational. As a result, I have been able to witness how the seemingly intractable resistances of self-care system can transform, and the defense system can even release its prisoners, its inner children. So what we're trying to do is, re-identify and free that inner child, because all of our problems as an adult is that inner child has been squashed. It's been, Pete Walker calls it arrested development. It means that you weren't allowed to develop properly. If you were abused, somebody came up to you and sexually abused you as a child, you didn't say no. You didn't have that ability. You weren't allowed to say no if it was your daddy or your uncle or whatever. It's tragic what goes on. If you had a parent that beat you, if you said no, you'd probably get beaten harder. So it means that we pick up all of this conditioning, and then we can't communicate ourselves or push back with people as an adult. We just sort of Pete Walker would call it fawn, like where people are abusive and you go into fawn and you're extra nice and compliant just so they be nice to you, like you're walking on eggshells, or you won't say if something's upset you. You'll just put up with it. I've had a recent experience where I've been, upset about something, and I had to, I have to speak up. Our feelings are really important, and we have to, say what we feel. And the other thing is, in saying what we feel, we can feel like, for years, I thought I'm going to be abandoned if I say what I feel. And when you get enough self-esteem, you'll realize, and you have some good people in your life, you'll realize that if you do speak up and somebody, walks away, so be it. There are other people in this world. Skip, a friend of mine, pointed out earlier, there are, there are 7.5 billion people in this world. So, we have got friends. If one friend wanders off, somebody new will come in. So, do get into groups out there on Facebook, good ones, where they're helping with C-PTSD. I've got a ladies group. I also chat with people on evolutionary astrology and chart work to look at trauma, and I share my wisdom. I'm good at that, I have to say. So, but because trauma does show up in a chart. So maybe a little bit more of this, and I'm going to close down for the night. But he then goes on to say, because psychotherapy is an attachment relationship, many of the injuries in our patients' early relational lives can be re-experienced towards a different outcome. So the whole point of therapy is that we get to talk about it and re-experience it to another outcome. So for instance, I think something I came up with today in my mind was, instead of saying, for instance, my abuse. I say the abuse that occurred, or my family, because I don't feel like I've had one at all. You know, you can say the family into which I was born. We can begin to see things in a different light and start using different language, and that will come with different feelings. And when we realize we're an adult and nobody can abuse us anymore, and that's the reality, you know, with regard to this matter. I mean, there are some parts of the world where abuse occurs and people have no chance, but you know, particularly I live in the UK. You know, if somebody abuses me, I can do something about it. And this, we've got to realize that the power, we do have the power, and we have to empower ourselves. And particularly, you know, I work with a lot of females and women. You know, there's no need to be in abusive relationships where people aren't loving and kind, and friendships as well. If people are abusive or they're not taken into account your trauma, or they don't get it, you know, maybe they're not the right people for you right now. So he did say that, didn't he? So he said about because psychotherapy is an attachment relationship, many of the injuries in our patients' early relational lives can be re-experienced towards a different outcome. Owing to the brain's plasticity, great news that bit, the rigid neural nets that are wired into the defensive patterns can be reconfigured and repaired. Psychoanalysts, including myself, have begun to realize that what has been broken relationally must be repaired relationally. So what that means, you know, if you've had no love in childhood and you've not been mothered or fathered in a kind way, or you know, the proper way, I think we all can agree with what that is. You know, it's a loving way. Then we have to do that relationally. We can do it through therapy or with friends. And, you know, as I say, as we get our self-esteem back and we get rid of the inner critic, we're going to keep developing, and our eyes will keep pinging open, and we'll begin to see more, and we'll see. And it will be sometimes painful as we're healing this, that we'll see things in people that will be a bit shocking to us. We might befriend somebody or get involved with somebody that we've thought were one way and they turn out to be another. And that's our cue to, you know, self-care, going back to proper self-care, you know, having a healthy boundary and knowing what we want for ourselves. And that might cause some sadness because it may mean that we've got to leave something behind. But again, we've got to, in adult form, we know everything ends and there's always fresh beginnings. So we don't need to lose our heads over people. But this is part of, you know, knowing what the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response is. It's a lot of work, but the work is worth it, I've got to tell you. Bit more. He says here, he says about the analyst tunes in. The analyst tunes in on an effect level to those dissociative gaps or places of derailment where the intimate feeling connection with the patient threatens to come apart. He says, as Broomberg 2016, and he goes 1812, demonstrates, the analyst must become a full partner in the dyadic regulation of affect and co-creation of an entirely new inner intersubjective reality. Fortunately, in this process, what the analyst says or does will be less important than how openly what does happen is processed with the Analyst. I'm so sure I'm not saying that right. I'll have to Google that one later. But he says, in the present book, the reader will see several vivid examples of the way the rigidities of the self-care system are slowly transformed through the relational struggles of the analytic psychotherapy. This transformation is illustrated in extended cases presented in chapters 4, 7, and 9, where the reader will observe the operation of this system over time, how it manifests in transference, and the slow transformation of its daimonic presences from malevolent to more benevolent forces. In each case, we witness how an archetypal story, whose original purpose is to save the soul, by splitting it off from the body slowly and with great resistance, becomes a more feeling and personal story, permitting the soul its unique incarnation to individual personhood. So the whole point is we're doing this work so we reclaim ourselves, that we grieve properly, that we can begin to love fully, you know, and ourselves, you know, love ourselves. And in this, you know, we help other people as well. So that's it for today. Thank you, Brave, for being there. I don't know if anybody else, I have 2 people watching. I really appreciate you for being there. And I hope anybody on the playback that watches this, that it's really helpful. And the book, again, you've already seen it if you've watched it. So that's it. And there's the 13 steps for managing flashbacks below. There's also my booking page if anybody wants to book an astrology chart reading with me, and to look at any PTSD because of my wisdom with it and now coming through my own trauma. And I also do a few other things that help people as well. Like I know how to use tapping, which does recontextualize. Fast EFT does recontextualize some stuff, but the very deep stuff does need proper care. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I'll be back tomorrow. I'm doing some astrology tomorrow night on the moon and our emotions and explaining that to people. Catch you later. Thank you.